Welcome to tonight's program of The Artist's Voice, Matthew Ritchie and Company. And I'm thrilled to introduce our next conversation with Matthew Ritchie, Caroline Jones, and Kevin Slavin. And now I'd like to hand over the microphone to our host, Matthew Ritchie.
Thanks, Monica, and thanks for coming. I'm so happy to be joined here tonight by Kevin Slavin and Caroline Jones, both from MIT. Not only because they're amazing academics, thinkers, intellectuals, and with a long string of projects, really too long for me to even articulate, but because they are among that small group of people who are interested in what happens next. And although we all imagine ourselves to be in a culture that is ardently looking towards solutions, too often we find ourselves ardently looking simply for novelty. So I think a question that this project raised for me was like, what, in a way, not to be critical of the premise of the project itself, is the purpose of an artist residency in any sort of institution? Having worked at MIT and having worked at Mass MoCA and having done gallery shows in Boston, Massachusetts has been very good to me. And it's in some ways on the forefront of thinking about art in an urban space. But as art becomes more popular, does it become more populist? And as it becomes more populist, does it become somehow less individuated? And as it becomes less individuated, does it really become, in a way, more hierarchical, even if the hierarchy substitutes the network for the pyramid? So Caroline's going to talk a little bit about some of her thoughts on this. She has a huge symposium opening next week that I would encourage you all to go to with is it fair to call him infamous, Bruno Latour? Darling of the art world at this time, a French philosopher, sort of one of the architects of sort of the new thinking in philosophy that's allowing us to reevaluate some of the basic relationships between art and science. And so this is the kind of image that we're all greeted with nowadays, a kind of happy, playable, Apple-centric world where technology is somehow going to make us all interconnect in ever increasingly joyous ways, as long as we keep paying our iCloud bills. And our children will pay ever larger iCloud bills. And one of the questions that Latour asks in an essay called Vision and Cognition is, what constitutes the mode of inscription of art into the world? And he lists this number of characteristics, which are on the left here: mobility, durability, flatness, scalability, reproducible, recombinant, superimposable, translatable, and consistent with geometry. These are all sort of, in a way, you could think of that list on the list as also like the Apple, go-to list, things that technology should do. Because they all share, that's my list on the right, basically geometric properties. They're all essentially commutative forms, which have to have a kind of gauge invariance for them to be sustainable. And this question of gauge invariance, this is from, these are sort of science fiction, but then there's, people in the movies, there's Google, there's Wikipedia, there's the NSA, there's all this stuff. This is one of my favorite, showing you which colors make you feel which way.
So good.
Corporate logoizing. Is upon us in a way that it's easy to say, well, technologies have emerged in the past. It was the same in 1901 and 1801 and 1701 and 1601. But the scale is different, and so is the interpenetration. So that's really what interests me. I've asked these two brilliant people here to sort of help me figure out if is there hope for artists, or are we going to be swallowed alive by JPEG factories? This is Wade Guyton's image. He was told that he was going to have one of his paintings, which was essentially a printout, up at auction, and it was expected to reach $10 million. So that day, he posted on Twitter his studio printer printing out 10 more identical copies of the same painting. Commentary or acquiescence. That's the kind of difficulty that faces artists right now, Ryan Carton, and so on and so forth, especially in a world where neural mapping is becoming ever more detailed, more perfect, more predictable, more able to predict us, more able to know what we are knowing without us even knowing it. This is the famous connectome that describes the human semantic space. So that's my introduction. I've got lots more pictures, but they're all kind of the same because the world has one feature. It's, the second law of thermodynamics predicts that as systems become more complex, they become more similar. It's not something you can second guess. It's a law of nature. And this is a map of the world's 38 most powerful companies, which are defined in power by the number of connections they have forged with all the other companies. In other words, if you do business with these 38 companies of any sort. This is going on everywhere, biodiversity, and then we drift into the world of fiction where we start to wonder, what will happen next? Not maybe in a good way, maybe in a bad way. The last thing I'd like to say is that when I grew up, there was a famous saying by Stuart Brand, which is information wants to be free. It was the hallmark of the early information age. We seem to have decided quite recently that we don't want information to be free. We don't want the iCloud, our pictures. We want it actually to be quite expensive and hard to get into. And above all, we want it to be watched at all times by private companies or the government working hand in glove with the same private companies. So what are we going to do about this when it finally wends its way into our pockets and our brains? Caroline?
Wow.
This is the famous diagram that when the US military produced this diagram, it's a causal loop. They realized that the war in Afghanistan could never be won because there were simply too many things in it that could fail. It's just simply too many unpredictable factors. It constitutes a classic causal loop. Any point of failure, the whole thing goes down. And they promptly began to plan very sensibly their withdrawal from an unwinnable scenario. Do we hide? Do we give in? What are we going to do, Caroline?
That's why you
We'll
never see.
figure it out, I guess.
Ta-da. Thank you. Caroline Jones. So we're going to talk about all that. Just bear that in mind. There will be a test later. If there's pieces of paper on your chairs, by the way, feel free to write down questions. We're collecting questions throughout the evening so that the moderator can choose the best ones for the end.
And we'll quickly scan them and put them up here to embarrass you.
Yes. Your name and address, social security number, and bank account.
And then pictures of your house.
So this was billed as a conversation, but then at the last minute, it was like, well, do you have a PowerPoint? So I was like, whoa, okay. So this is in some sense what's on the top of my head, but in another sense, it responds to the kind of things that Matthew Ritchie puts in my head. So maybe I'm just a data point for a receptive sphere. So I'm starting with this, which is a super famous network or net or tree diagram by Charles Darwin. And my favorite part, aside from the drawing itself, which is this dendritic structure, are the two words he puts at the top. I think, right? So we have from the beginning both a map of what he's beginning to have an inkling is evolution, what he wants to argue is evolution, but we also have a map of his own thought process, right? A kind of a diagram of what it might be to think through a system that he later will admit is completely tangled, right? And to try and untangle something that can be studied as a scientist. So I started thinking about this recently again because there's a pioneering neuroscience, and you always have to put the two words together, pioneering neuroscientist, because if you're not pioneering, then you might as well be a good old psychologist from the 1930s. In any case, Josh Tenenbaum is trying to kind of concertize a lot of the findings of neuroscience over the last 25 years and trying to figure out kind of where the field is. And one of the places he's doing this is through statistical modeling, which is an old AI, paradigm of trying to do a synthetic mind and then see how much like the human mind is it. And the answer is it's not very much like the human mind. It's got some really significant flaws, creativity, for example. But there are some interesting things that he's at least speculating about. And one of them has to do with these kinds of diagrams. The stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and this is all my layman's interpretation of his papers, one of which is called How to Grow a Mind, so you can read it in Science magazine. And these stages are stages of child development and language acquisition. So they have everything to do with about 40 of the slides you showed, if we slowed them down and looked in on them. So just to, again, start on things kind of migrated here, but basically the first stage is the child's rudimentary concept. Like, they're things that move. They're things that move in my world, and sometimes they're called trucks, and sometimes they're called horses, sometimes they're called birds, and I'm sitting here trying to make sense of these categories in order that I can remember them, in order that I can access them again, right? So this is a computer paradigm being forwarded, but the idea is that those sorts of complex groupings might look like this: unconnected little stars of properties, red, outside, fast, furry, right? Stage 2 is when they start to be connected, not necessarily in a, quote, rational way, but in a way that starts to say, well, some of these things are living and some of them are not. So some of them move, but they're actually trucks and they're not alive, and some of them move and there's something called animals, and so on and so forth. What I want to focus on is this stage 3, which of course looks remarkably like Darwin's diagram, and it also looks remarkably like the dendritic structure of the neuron itself, right? That homology is not an accident. I mean, as an art historian, we would want to analyze the epistemic foundations of why you would draw your network in a form that would look like Darwin's tree diagram, right? Why are you picking that particular two-dimensional form to represent your thinking about this kind of connectivity? Now, in place of my bad PowerPoint text application on top of this drawing I made, I'll put Josh's own drawing from the paper, which is how this stage 3, is modeled in his statistical model. So the distance of lines has something to do with a statistical analysis that I am not going to be able to explain to you. But the point is, it more or less makes sense in a certain frame, like, well, ants and cockroaches do belong in some Linnaean category, and horses and cows belong in some other Linnaean category. So this is a way in which thinking makes sense of all these different phenomena, and so on and so forth. Now, what's interesting, and why I like Josh Tenenbaum's work so much, is that for him, this is just one of many possible mappings. In other words, his statistical modeling, which then goes back into human experimentation, makes the point that this kind of tree structure is only one way to understand how the mind thinks, and he's got a whole bunch of them. So for example, if you, and I don't know how much of this you can make out, but if you begin to ask people about how they remember and recall places and the relationships between places and how they would structure that in their minds, they make a completely different kind of diagram that has to do with spatial proximity, that has to do, in other words, the kinds of statistics that the mind is marshaling to model different sorts of relationships are actually different. They actually structure different kinds of mental abstractions and different kinds of mental maps. So I think this is quite fascinating because it has to do with all kinds of potentialities that we feel within the human mind, but in plasticity and learning and all kinds of things. This is a rather unfortunate kind of image here at the lower left that tracks very well with PRISM and a lot of the AI funding that's coming through DARPA and things like that, where you have a kind of like, skin color, criminality, right? I mean, there are lots of old paradigms being imported into these new research protocols. But I still think there's something potentially opening about this new phase of neuroscientific research, that it is actually exploring how actual humans in the world do think and do cluster information and do structure it in order to remember it. And then it asks the question, well, these are not the same kinds of systems. So how do we want to use them? Now, this has materialized form in certain artist practices. I mean, Matthew's would be one of them, and I'm going to end up with, two tiny little images of his work. But this one is by Thomas Saraceno, and the aforementioned infamous Bruno Latour has found this materialization extremely useful to think with. So this is Saraceno's installation made of bungee cords, installed at the Venice Biennale in 2009 with this long and poetic title. The point was that this materialization of a kind of organization of space in a very diagrammatic form through points of tension and elastics helped Latour get beyond what was, in his mind, a kind of unfruitful conflict between the model of the network and the model of spheres, whether they be atmospheres or spheres of influence or other kinds of holisms that were being postulated as a way to think about organizing information. So for Latour, this was a revelatory artwork, and he thought a lot about it, and he talked about how the spheres formed through a net materially. And this, so art has heuristic value in a lot of ways by just, if you make something literal and material, you get to see how lifting one piece of elastic might not deform the whole network, but would certainly deform that sphere, right? So there's certain implications that you can then play out and see how that metaphor has to evolve to capture that level of material resistance in the physical world in which we live in. Now, Saraceno, being in conversation with Latour, then said, like, oh, you want spheres? I'll give you spheres. So he then does space-time foam in a big hangar in Milan and sort of, again, in a kind of wonderfully dopey way, literalizes the metaphor and then brings up other parameters and other problems. So how do you make judgments about what the people across, the strangers on the other side of you are going to do? Because if you get it wrong, you'll all end up in a sort of gravitational plastic black hole, and it will be very unpleasant for you. So there are many interesting implications that we can pull out of this. I think what I want to end with is, again, one of the lessons from these statistical modelers of mental processes, which are, it doesn't have to be that way, right? I mean, I think this is a time when proliferating certain kinds of metaphors and not worrying too much about whether they rule each other out might be a productive operation to have. So even Latour, who kind of is stuck on a current search for, the Gaia metaphor and how we might think it through, maybe on a certain huis clos, a certain kind of no exit pathway. So I guess the only take-home message is that by materializing and then abstracting and then materializing again and then abstracting, I mean, through these processes, I think you just proliferate ways of thinking about being human and being in the world, and perhaps that's the only optimism we can muster at this point. How's that?
It's good. It's good.
And here, of course, we're looking at this iterative algorithmic process that Matthew engaged in with his collaborators on this project. Looks a lot better on the computer than it does in projection. And then, of course, this one. So, yeah, here's where we need your hundreds of slides about your own work to better explore these.
Later, be patient.
Okay, all right.
Promise. Well, I think that's a super great summary. And, when I was in conversation with Graham Harman, who's done extensive analysis of Latour's, the problems in Latour's work, as well as the advantages of it, the question comes up fairly quickly of what constitutes force relations. And this is where the kind of fundamental, the invisible starts to enter our conversation. But it's very, I think Kevin's going to talk somewhat about this question in some roundabout way. I'm pretty sure of it. Because the question is like, what governs the relations between things? And of course, a philosopher wants to believe, if you take Graham Harman is an American philosopher working in Cairo, posits basically, and he would hate me for saying this, that there's four kind of polarities of thinking, and everything is made up. We think about everything in four ways at once. We think of it as an idea. We think of its social meaning. We think of it as an object that presents itself to us sensually or materially. And then there's the part of it that we can't think about, which is what we don't know about it, and we will never know about it. But we know that that part is missing and can never be engaged by us cognitively. What no philosopher has yet done is what Saraceno does in his piece, which is sort of literally inscribe a set of force relations. It's like if you climb on it, it bounces. You know, we don't have a little bounceometer for the set of relations that govern our society. Thank goodness. But I suspect Kevin's going to tell us about the people who are working quite hard
I can do that. Yeah, sure.
Because that is kind of the question that you're making. It's like once we establish, and it seems as if we are heading towards a topology of relations that where the spatial relations of neurological structure can be understood. At that point, their physics is going to be much more accessible once we sort of grasp how all those neurons, because they will follow a set of physical laws. They have to.
Right, and mind you, there are bodies of material in the brain that neuroscience has yet to even encounter, like the gluons, which turn out to be the cleaning staff, which interests me a lot. The chemicals, which are necessary to get from this dendritic neuron to that dendritic neuron. And by the way, the chemicals that are floating around in there, it's like if the gluons don't clean them up, then they're available for other kinds of chemical reactions. So the episteme of the research so far is fixated on the cranium and the neuron. And
it's also, I had this weird conversation with, at the Media Lab, there's a guy who runs the Synthetic Neurobio Lab, is Ed Boyden, and they're doing this amazing work right now where they can actually say, we were just talking about it, they can see the neural transmissions more or less real time in a worm at the moment, and theoretically in a mammal, and eventually principle in the human brain. And so I was talking to him about it, and I was saying, so that's kind of it then, right? It's like then it's just a computational problem, right? It's like you just need to scale it up. And his answer was really good, and it was like that's the difference between how a scientist would answer it and like anybody else. He said basically like, well, yeah, if it turns out that electrical neural transmissions are actually what thinking is about, right? Which would be an incredible coincidence because that's how computers work, right? Like it's just like it would just be like. But if indeed that is the case, then yeah, we will. But there's no real reason to think that. It's just that's we've taught ourselves to look at the brain like the most sophisticated machines we've been able to build, and meanwhile, every day we're sort of learning with other machines that there's something that lies sort of just beyond that. We just don't. We literally can't conceive it. Right?
It's like Leibniz imagining the mind is like a giant loom because he invented a machine that could simulate thinking. Like
actually, I'll show you.
Please do.
I had no idea we were going to talk about this, but I'll show you. This is something this is what we're thinking about.
And by the way, the tree doesn't work anymore for evolution because species aren't really species, and animals are breeding across these lines.
The new one is just a big circle with lots of millions of little spokes coming off it.
This is so I've been not this. Okay, so I have like 400 images in here because I didn't know what we were going to talk about. But on this thing that we were just talking about, so the thing that's been really interesting for me lately has just been learning more and more about the microbiome, which is the 6 pounds of you that's in your gut that is you, basically. It's so if we're like 100 trillion pieces of genetic material, only 10% of that is actually human, and the rest of that are parasites and bacteria and all the things that are inside that are literally not human, right? Their DNA has nothing to do with ours, and who we are is, just from if you were to map it out, it's 90% all this other stuff, and it's not as simple as saying that those are the things that just help you digest things, because they're actually the things that like some of the latest studies have just been, if you alter certain things in the gut flora, people will become more or less anxious or depressed. If you have toxoplasmosis, which 1 in 3 of you have, you're more likely to crash your car. You're more likely to take risks or be promiscuous.
On that side of the room.
I am not judging you. I'm just saying that 1 out of 3 of you has it. The people who have cats have it.
Oh, sorry, it's you guys. You're there.
And it's something that lives in your gut and changes literally how you think. So the idea of the brain as the seat and the core of all human experience, I think, is something that's sort of slowly fading, and it's happening right as we're beginning to kind of just maybe beginning to crack certain things about the brain. But it's like, well, maybe the brain isn't as important in our experience as we thought it is, and so that was sort of actually the starting point for this thing that's evolving.
Can I
right
just
now.
ask you, what is this picture?
Yeah, so this is a drawing. So these are drawings.
cool.
So these are sketches for something that we're just starting to build now. That's called Homeostasis. So this is totally in progress. This will be. Well, I hope actually it'll be roughly this scale when it's built. It'll be built out of glass and tubes. It'll be the 11 systems of the human body. So integumentary, circulatory, excretory, respiratory, et cetera. Everything.
Love this.
Huh? Yeah.
Latour is it's gonna flip him out.
What's that?
Latour is gonna flip out. Spheres inside spheres.
But there's no. It's going to be all. This is right now 3.5 of the systems. It's the integumentary, endocrine, and it's pseudo-respiratory up there, and skeletal at the bottom. I'll explain in a second. But there'll be 7 more, maybe 8 if we can figure out reproduction, because how this thing will reproduce is unclear to me. But it's the 11 systems that make you you. You have a circulatory system, you have a respiratory system, and all those systems actually kind of come together and do stuff in you. But we're not building a brain. We're building all the parts of, wow, that's just, thanks everybody.
So tell me about 11 systems.
Okay, so all right, so there's these 11 systems that make us us, and what we're doing is we're building each one of them, and we're building them in relationship to each other. So all right, so the integumentary system at the top there is basically gonna, which is like our skin. It's the thing that takes. The integumentary system is the system that takes external stimuli and converts them into signals that we are gonna do something with. So it's like when you shiver when it's cold, that's the integumentary system. It's taking cues off the skin. And so in this case, that's gonna be taking light from the room that this is installed in and converting that into heat. That'll be traveling down into the endocrine system, which will be using the heat that the integumentary system is producing in response to the light. So this will be much more active during the day. And it will basically be stimulating the skeletal system, which in this case will be kind of excreting cellulose onto the structure of the thing. So as this progresses, it'll be growing a skeleton for itself and getting bigger and stronger over time, I hope.
So it's a baby. You're making a baby.
A baby without a brain, yeah, and a big one, like, you know, big. Yeah, making a big baby without a brain. That's actually it's also it's going to be in so it's called homeostasis, and it's in a homeostatic relationship to the room. So it's going to be pulling the air out of the HVAC systems in the room, and pulling water out of the plumbing, and sending. It has an excretory system, so it's going to shit into the pipes as well. But it's really, you know, it'll be manifest in the middle of the room, and in, you know, direct the systems of this thing that's not the big baby without a brain. I'll show you a little bit. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks.
Well, this is a fascinating, because of course as a painter, when you were talking about the diffusion of
of molecules through a topological system, or the question that Kevin was talking about, like, is the network really doing anything, or is it just reacting? This question of kind of systemic drift and sort of infiltration is always it is a shift from the question that we had in the 20th century, which was, how is everything like photography, or how is everything like a circuit, which is a very passive way of thinking. This is drifting into this kind of biopunk modality that seems very different. You talked a lot about this in Sensorium, your book, on this sort of sense of the body as a kind of
Homeostatic, surfing.
phasic state.
Yeah. Yeah. I was interested when you said, 90% of the stuff isn't us or something.
Yeah.
I mean, so first of all, how are those boundaries being drawn?
So when I refer to that, that's just if you were to map out all the genetic material that's in you, right? Only 10% of it is what is
expressed.
No. Only 10% of it is human.
Of your mass.
Of your, right? It's like, so if you were to just map all the DNA that's in you,
Or on
right,
you.
it's that very, very little of it is what we think of as us. And really, the other 90% is like all these other actors, that have their own agendas. Some of them are spawned when you first eat chocolate. Some of them are spawned when you have a cat. Some of them are because you're on a specific latitude and longitude. It has a lot to do with what you eat. It has a lot to do with what your mom ate. You can, they do poop transplants. That's what they're doing. They're swapping out that 90%, and that will change your life. Like it changes your mind, like not just your poop. It's super, super unnerving. There's
Quite literally, good pun.
Yeah. See what I did there? No, the vagus nerve is what runs in between part of the brain and the gut, and so.
VAGUS,
Yeah.
not VAGA.
Yeah, right. That's right. Good point. Yeah, don't. And so it's like all these things that instinctively, like when you're really nervous and you feel it here and whatnot. Like that's not, or like I feel it in my gut or whatever. Like that's actually happening, right? And you're actually producing serotonin in your gut, and that's just the whole. There's this idea that there was this. It's nobody really wants to think about the idea that the whole universe doesn't revolve around the Earth, except that it turns out to be true that the Earth is revolving around the sun. And nobody really wants to think about the fact that humans aren't really super, super special, that they're just another point on a whole bunch of arcing trees that come out of evolution. And there may be this other threshold, which is like the things that we assume are a function of thinking and the brain in terms of human experience may not actually reside in where we...
The cranium.
Yeah, in the cranium, right? That may, there's a strong assist. But
that sort of raises the question, which is really why you guys are perfect to answer this, which Latour raises and is raised again in Quentin Meillassoux, is this question of transhumanism, or what constitutes, if we choose to maintain. So what we're all really describing, and that all sounds super technical even to me, is what we're learning about the universe. Once again, we used to think the brain lived in the heart. Mm-hmm. We used to think the brain lived in Grandpa's grave. He could come out and talk to us. We've located the human psyche in multiple locations. We're constantly shifting it around. It doesn't really matter where it is. The question is what it is and how do we want to articulate it? And that's really what Latour is grappling with. And I think a lot of the questions about these technologies, as it will become quite feasible to reprogram you, not with a computer program, but with an infusion of neurochemicals that are designed to affect the 3 trillion inhabitants of your gut. It's going to become very, very easy. For example, where I'm from, in England, the entire water supply has got Prozac in it. You cannot get a glass of water from a tap that doesn't have Prozac in it. It's just there. And populations are going to have to learn to deal with this kind of drift. And I was just reading that if you have a little lithium, it's good for you in towns that have lithium in the water.
Well, that was actually how they
lower
discovered the
suicide
psychopharmaceutical properties, because there were no schizophrenics in those towns.
So this question of who you are and what you do with your time is going to become much more amorphic, because the tree structure itself is reassuringly like a tree, at least. You know, you can sort of cling to that. But the pool of bacteria.
Yeah.
is
And also, I mean, the
gonna be-
the idea that your fundamental experience of the world is being acted upon by something is like, it's hard to get your head around that.
Well,
But
it's a
here's where
pre-Socratic
I would add this critique, because that binary is who is the you that is being
Right,
acted upon.
right.
In other words, you are this complicated connectivist,
Right.
take away my bacteria, there's no me.
Yeah.
I mean, so whatever this fantasy of individualism is not going to hold.
Yep.
And that's really what Latour's been obsessed about in the past 5 years with his Gaia
Yeah.
thing, is sort of how can we get to a place where our very language changes
Yeah.
in how we talk about these things, because otherwise we're not going to be able to evolve
Yeah.
to meet these challenges, and we'll just be extinct, which we will then deserve, right? I mean, that's where Matthew's monstrance comes in, you know, the sort of post-apocalyptic, we got
Well,
what we deserved.
I think that's very much something that I'm interested in from the artist's perspective. Is this one position is let us dissolve ourselves into the soup, whether it's a biological or technological soup. It's like just pour funding into it, and we'll find out how to be transhuman creatures. You know, we'll grow unicorn horns with wireless transmitters in them, and we'll all live underwater in domed cities.
And we'll
become-
get that tree from, you know,
Yeah, we'll become
Avatar.
algal
We'll get that tree and we'll have all that
symbiotes.
good
We'll grow the
stuff.
shit out of it. Yeah,
Yeah.
it'd be great.
Yeah.
And the other is, we'll become robots, or
Yeah.
we'll do all these things, but there seems to be very little. The most likely thing is none of those things will happen. We'll retain our essential biological identity in a very, very radically physically changed world, and we will grapple with that.
Can I show this other thing we're working on?
Please.
Yeah. So there's this other thing that we're working on that we're working on. This is actually what Seiwei and Taylor are working on. We're working on
Yay.
it with the Dalai Lama Center at MIT, and. No. Well, we're going to see this. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Good. All right. So this is what it is. This is like 40 seconds. So this is for your phone, and it installs onto your phone, and it just basically starts recording everything that you do, like NSA style, and sends that to one other person in the world who you will never know and never meet. And we assign to you.
The NSA will know.
Yeah, the NSA will know, but they know already. I mean, it's fine. Like that's their job. Like my job's different. But so this is basically pairing two people in the world and sending their lives to each other.
These two people are very busy.
This one is not so busy.
This
That's not really fair. That was a busy person on the right. But this is, and so we're working on this right now, okay. But this really, let me see if I can find let me just find one. Okay. This really comes from, it comes from this thing that so we've shifted from thinking about the world entirely in terms of ourselves, because we have these very powerful networks that allow us to connect with anybody. And the problem is that we don't connect with everybody. That what we've actually done is reinforced existing structures. What the social graph does not open up the world. It actually narrows it down. It actually constrains it, and at the same time, it makes the world feel bigger. Facebook makes the world feel bigger, but what it actually does is it hardens the edges in a way that, like, New York City doesn't. In a way that, Beijing does not.
I just read that Facebook is the #1 site for stalking.
I got to get on that.
And harassment.
We can
people
totally
harassers
outdo
and
that.
harassers and stalkers choose Facebook 10 times more often than any other social network.
Any other social, they've moved on.
What happened to Craigslist? Wasn't that like the main vector for the killers and the stalkers and the...
But we wanted to build something that would bring you into contact and connection with somebody who is not in your social graph, who you wouldn't meet, who you have no connection to, who is as far away from you as we can possibly determine.
So the spatial distance is important.
That's one piece of it. And if we end up getting any personal information from you, and we're torn about whether to do that, if you sign in with Facebook, which I'm not sure whether we'll do or not, we'll make sure that you're at least 10 hops away from whoever it is, right? Like, the goal is to produce as much distance as possible with whatever it is we can possibly know, whether it's geographic or social, whatever it is.
But they'll have to have an iPhone, and they'll have to have...
No, they'll have to have a smartphone, but that's a lot. That's
Yeah,
still a lot.
that's still a lot.
It's definitely not everybody, but it's a lot of people.
Do you know the Miranda July piece?
I do,
Yeah.
yeah.
So this is a piece, do you know this?
Yeah.
So
But they may not know it.
you sign up, and if you send a message to your friend, then, I don't know, does she have a connection with the NSA? But anyway, she finds the person standing closest to your friend and sends the message to them instead.
Right.
And then
Yeah.
they have instructions to walk over to the person that looks like the person who was
Yeah.
supposed to get the text and actually tell them the text
Yeah.
from their friend.
No one has ever delivered any of my messages. It might be me, but I've tried it like 5 times and nobody
Maybe
ever
it just
gets it.
doesn't work.
Well, I don't know if it's the. It might be what I'm saying.
Which
It
would
might
be
be the
okay.
people. But I'm.
But it's also like if I get a random text message, what the fuck?
I always
message-
answer.
your
it.
message
I
probably
always
aren't.
answer
Delete
it.
that.
Probably not.
Delete
No,
that
answer.
stuff.
You answer that.
They're
like,
not
where
whimsical
that's
enough.
gonna
That's
go.
the problem.
What's
You've
that?
got to be much more whimsical.
So this is the time where we actually magisterially wrap up
Yeah,
and solve the problem of global
The problem of
warming.
individuation and connection. Because that's really, for artists, that's the central dilemma. It's like, of course, you can buy into, and in the end, we can all be sitting around, it's Soylent Green, it's people, all eating one slurry of pheromonal, communicative cocktail where instantly we revert back to the global group mind, and therefore we eat less chocolate and sugar and don't drive cars, and it's not clear where this ends, right? Like the premise of the Gaia is basically we should go away. We should revert back to a much simpler way of life. The premise of the technology networks is not that. It's a vast carbon footprint of, no offense to this, but
Sure.
this
Yes.
doesn't come out of nowhere. There's
That's right.
30 nuclear power plants a day are required
Sure.
to sustain the internet. The full output. I mean, it's not a cheap process.
Right.
And these two things seem to have a fundamental disconnect. And then there's the artist in between who's, are we going to become existentialists and all be like, oh, the universe is so big. It's a very French way to do with it. If only we could connect, but it is too big. To the bar. To the bar.
Well, I think there's
Or the
one...
Anglo-Saxon approach, can we come up with a practical network of things that will
Let's go
join
back
us?
to that menu. Shut down your machine right now. But for me, the commonality here is this strange step of materialization. Until you materialize the giant baby without a brain, you don't know
That you have to kill it.
There's a heuristic at MIT, which is through synthesis, we understand. And that is common over here. And I wonder if that's something that you want to own as well. In other words, materialization is a way of testing this view of the world and a way of modeling a slightly different view of the world.
I think that's absolutely where we're at. I'm very curious about what will happen next, because there's obviously a kind of critical mass. There'll be some kind of tipping point just as of connectivity, of just the thermodynamics, just will take us there.
Well, that's perfect because everyone's coming back.
Yes.
7 to hear
On that
what
note,
happens next.
Well, it'll be what happened last spring. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks.
Please circulate your questions to somebody if you have written them down. If not, think now hard and save them for later. Thank you.